Hey guys, my name is Clay Williams, and today I want to talk to you about freehand. Now, I know freehand is a scary word for a lot of people, but I'm going to make it a little bit simpler for everybody today with this little tutorial. Now, I want you to take your colors and forget about them for a moment. We're just going to be using black and white. What we want to focus on is the freehand, the drawing. We don't want to have to worry about color, because color makes everything a little bit more difficult, so we're just going to focus on value. And value is black and white. I'm going to add my black and my white to my palette. And for today, we're going to be painting a skull. And we know in wargaming, everybody needs more skulls. So when you start, you want to prime dark. Black is preferable. If you haven't, you can go ahead and base coat your shield or whatever you're freehanding, your tank, wherever the freehand's going to be. You want to make sure you have a good black base to start with. Now I've primed this model in black, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to lay down a layer of my Reaper black because I want to have a normal acrylic base. I don't want to have a primed layer to paint my freehand on. Now when you're working with freehand, it's very important to have reference. So I've pulled up an image of a skull, and I'm going to be using that as my reference while I paint it. I've also, prior to this video, painted up a skull on a shield like we're going to be practicing on today. And I'll show that to you in a little bit. So when we start out, what we want to do is we want to mix up a fairly dark gray. And what we're going to do with this dark gray is we're going to sketch the shape of the skull, and we're not going to worry about it being perfect. This is only to develop shapes. So when you look at a skull, you can divide it into a few simple shapes. You have the round top part of the skull and the square bottom of the jaw. So when I start this, I'm just going to lay it out by roughly painting my round shape onto my shield where I want my skull to be. It doesn't have to be exact either. We can go in and adjust this in a minute to make sure that we have it in the right spot and it's taking up the amount of space that we want it to. You can barely see this gray, and that's good. That's how we want it. We want it to be easy to adjust. This is our guideline. So now that I have my circle, it's the base shape of the skull, we're going to add the square part at the bottom for our jaw. Now I'm going to go a little bit lighter for the camera so you guys can see the shapes that I'm putting on this shield. But when you're at home, it's okay to stay really dark because that makes the shapes easier to adjust. So there's my circle shape, top of the head. Now I want to take that same color and sketch in where my jaw goes. And the good thing about working with dark gray is that it coats really well. So I'm not struggling trying to put a white skull with white paint on a black background. I'm going to build this up over time. All right, so now that I have my basic shape of a skull, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for where the black areas are in the skull. I'm going to take my black, I'm going to go in, I'm going to mark where my nose is. Simple shape, not trying to get the exact look of a skull nose, just a little triangle to mark where it is. And then where my eyes are. Again, doesn't have to be exact. What we're doing is we're sketching. And if anybody has ever drawn anything for Halloween, you can draw this skull. Simple shapes, laying it out. We're working our way toward the end result. I'm going to take my black. I'm going to mark out where my teeth need to be, or where the intersection of my teeth need to be. and then where my upper jaw separates from my lower jaw. Again, super simple. Everyone can do this. All right, now that I have a general idea of where my shapes are, I want to start building my value. I want to start increasing the light tones and start paying attention to my highlights. So I'm gonna mix up some more gray, just a little bit lighter than my previous gray. And again, I'm gonna sketch. It doesn't have to be exact. I'm gonna start developing where my broad highlights are. Side of the head here, over the eyes. On the cheeks. Under the eyes, top of the nose. Above the teeth. And while I'm doing this, I'm also paying attention to how the light divides up the shapes of the face, because we have the broad general circle that we developed, and the light is what actually divides that shape up and makes the contours that makes it look like a skull. The bottom of the jaw has a pretty strong highlight. Now when I'm looking at my reference, I can pick and choose what I want to use because we have a face and it's two halves. If I like the way one half looks better in that light and I want to apply that to the other side, I can just mirror what I've done on the left side or the right side.
We went up there for the opener, and when they did, they opened like 3 months later. So they rented out a hotel.
All right. Second layer of highlight. Now, if I notice an area where I messed up, which everyone does when they're doing freehand, I have a deep shadow on the temple of this skull that I want to put in. This dark gray method of freehand, I can go back and I can add that shadow really easy. Up above the eyes, where the temples are.
But the store's nice. It's got 55.
I do like all the fun jazz that they got in there. Like, they'll have like parts of the wall. Looks like
I've gone in and cut in these two areas on the temple from my reference, looking at the skull. Now, once I'm happy with where I have these base highlights built up, I can go in and take my gray, and I can worry about a little bit of blending. So I'm just going to take a gray that's between these two colors and start to soften up where I put these broad highlights. add just a little more black. Now we're working with black and gray. You'll notice that the gray will always go on just a touch lighter than it dries. You want to be aware of that so that you don't accidentally make your gray a little bit too dark when you're trying to blend the grays together. And since our subject matter is a skull, skulls aren't super smooth. They're pitted. There's a lot of surface detail. So don't worry about making the skull super, super slick or super, super smooth.
Yeah, the traffic was abnormally bad trying to get out of Austin for some reason.
All right. Next, I want to put in or mark where my teeth are going to go. So I have my black line that I sketched in earlier. And I'm going to use a little bit lighter gray to mark in the front two top teeth. Now teeth, when we're viewing them from the front, get progressively smaller as we're looking at them. So beside these two front teeth, I want to start marking in little squares. I don't have to follow the teeth that are on my reference, because I don't want to spend hours and hours painting this just for the teeth. So you can do simple shapes to represent that upper row and bottom row of teeth. And teeth, when you're generally looking at a skull, they curve just a little bit, and that's showing the depth of them moving back in the skull. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the bottom row of teeth. Mark in two smaller teeth. Generally, you can fit about 4 bottom teeth where you can fit your front 2 teeth, the upper 2 teeth. So make those a little bit smaller. And again, these are curving upward as you add them, just to show depth. Now my chin, after adding those teeth, may be a little bit small. That's why we're working in black and gray. We can go in and we can take our base color and we can just extend the chin just a little bit. All right. Now, I want to pick a spot, since I have everything for my skull laid out, and start to render each one of those areas pretty heavily until I'm done, and then move on to another area. So let's work our way from the top to the bottom, since my skull gets more complex as you move from the top to the bottom. So the top is generally a sphere with 2 breaks in the top. So first, let's go in reading order. Let's darken up our shadow where the first break in the skull is, as it goes over the eye socket and around the temple. Now, just like I would blend any other color, I'm going to progressively add white to increase the value of my highlights until I get to white or almost white, depending on how bright I want the highlight to be or how bright you want the highlight to be. So now as I have the top left portion of the skull as we're looking at it, or the top right side of the skull, I've noticed that I don't like how round we have this skull. So I'm going to take my black, I'm going to use it just like I'd use an eraser. I'm going to turn it over, and I'm going to pull this black and reshape the outside temple area of this skull. And now that I've pulled that in just a little bit, I'm more happy with that shape. And that's an easy correction. If we had color on this model and we had blends of color, I'd have to go back, reblend colors. Now I can just take black and erase it. So now I'm working above the eye, the top of the skull, which is, again, it's pretty much a sphere. I'm not so worried about the shape of the eye while I'm doing this, because I have black and I can go in and reshape the eye however I want once I have the highlights in for the area around my eyeball. And again, just increasingly adding white to our gray, step by step, to develop the shape of the skull. Now, I do recommend when you're painting skulls to keep that texture of the bone. Go ahead and kind of stipple or vibrate your hand a little bit, kind of poke at the model, and that'll give you a little bit of that pitted look with the surface of the bone. I added too strong of a highlight to the top of the head, so what I'm going to do is take some darker gray and just erase it. So much easier than if I had been trying to paint a bone white on top of black. Alright, so now the top half of the skull, the top above the eye, is done. I'm going to move on to this area on the skull.
Sadly, so, no, but when I first started the company, I
We're still working up our gradient, developing our highlights and our shape just for the top of the skull. And I promise you guys, if you work with black and white for a little while and put down the color, you're going to increase your ability to blend colors together as well. So now we've got the other half of the skull shaded in. We're going to work on the temple. And while I'm painting this, let's talk about brushes for a second. It is really important that you have the correct tools for the job. I use a Winsor Newton Series 7. This brush. Size 0, round. It's not a miniatures brush. It's not a miniature brush because they do make a miniature line. It is the normal size brush. The miniature line just means that it has a shorter bristle, and it actually makes it harder to apply the paint because that shorter bristle, the paint will dry a lot faster on the tip of your brush because it doesn't have all the moisture in the bristles to keep that paint active. And that's the job of the bristle fiber, or else everybody be painting with toothpicks. That bristle keeps the paint wet when I lift it from my palette, put it on my object. I do know some guys that paint with toothpicks. I wouldn't recommend it. And just like this side over here is a little bit too round. So I'm going to take my black and I'm going to cut in the edge of the skull here. Super easy. I can control my shape. Go in and erase. All right, so looking at this, I feel like the nose may be a little bit too low. So I can do one of two things. I can move the nose, or I can just extend it a little bit and then pull that highlight on the bottom up. So I'm gonna pull the middle section up just a little bit higher. Now I like that a lot better because it sits right under the eyes. And so I'm gonna pull in that bottom little heart shape, upside down heart shape. And highlight it around. And again, this shape does not have to be perfect on the nose because even on my reference, it's not perfect. The hole is just a hole of bone. Now there's a pretty strong highlight that runs down the middle ridge of the nose bone. I'm going to lay that in. So as I'm doing that, adding that highlight between the eyes, It looks like I need to adjust those eye sockets a little bit. So I'm going to round them out. Again, just using my black as an eraser to control the shape. Going back to the top of the nose. Adding that really strong ridge highlight. This one side got curved in a little bit while I was pulling a highlight. I'm gonna take my black, push that back out just a little bit. All right, so now let's work over here on the cheek. Start developing our higher highlights on that side of the skull. Now, looking at my reference, this side is actually brighter than this side, but I'm gonna paint this side like that one. I'm gonna make it a little bit brighter just so I can see the shapes. Now this is just because of the light source of where the skull was photographed from. We're not changing any of the shapes. All we're doing is changing the value. Now, if you look at the shape of the nose, it flows down in a triangle to the top of the teeth on the skeleton. So I'm going to go ahead and add those, or in the skull, I'm going to go ahead and add those simple little highlights in as a guideline. Added those right there. So there's my triangle. Kind of a round bottom where my teeth are. Adding my bright highlights. I'm still working on this left side here. I'm going to add a bright highlight that comes under the eye just to develop that shape a little bit and to show that the ocular cavity sort of protrudes. Now I'm going to take this and just mimic what I've done on one side on the other side. Again, I'm going to add this stark white highlight, pure white. I already have all my shapes, so I'm just increasingly pulling in, making each subsequent brighter color until I get to my white smaller and smaller. All right, so now we have the top of our skull. Let's start working on that upper row of teeth. All right, so we do have a little bit of dark gray behind the teeth, but you don't have to go in and add black in between each teeth. What we're gonna do is just highlight those teeth, and they'll create their own sort of natural shadow. Teeth are a pretty basic shape, so we don't have to try and render those as heavily. And they're pretty small here. Now, if the skull was a little bit bigger, you could treat them just like any other shape. Sketch them out, give them their own area. And then once you have everything in its place, go in and start highlighting them and making them look a little more realistic each time you add a highlight. Now for teeth, when you're highlighting, a tip to make those teeth look like they're coming forward in the skull is to only put your bright white highlights on the front 4 teeth. Leave everything else at that medium or light gray.
Yeah, but I mean, my thing was that going back to what we talked about.
All right, so I have a dark spot right above the teeth that I want to lighten up just a little bit so it doesn't look like he has a hole right above his teeth. So I'm going to go ahead and add that little bit of brightness. And this is also a round surface because it follows how the teeth protrude. So I'm going to add just a couple ridges to show that each socket for the tooth has a little bit of highlight to it. Again, it's just a simple shape. It's just a cylinder. Everybody can paint a cylinder. So I've added the upper lip area right under the nose. So now I want to work on the bottom teeth, but some of these teeth might be a little bit longer than others, so I'm going to take a little bit of my dark gray and just pull a line underneath that row of teeth before I start my bottom row of teeth, just to even them up a little bit. And just like I did with my top row of teeth, I'm going in and I'm adding just little square shapes. And it's okay if some of them touch each other. Teeth sometimes do that. They don't have to be perfect. The same thing I did with the upper teeth. I'm going to work my highlight increasingly brighter toward the front teeth.
It's definitely, I mean, just, Shay shows up and all of a sudden there's a whole
He doesn't. As a matter of fact, he was one of the people I asked to teach a gym class. And yeah, because I figured, I mean, he teaches on the video, so we're all shredded, right? And I told him, and I said,
All right, so now I have my bottom row of teeth locked in. Let's start on the left side of the jaw here and pull my reference back up. All right, there's a shape here in the black that I'm going to develop just a little bit more for the bottom jawline.
I have 18,
I'll go ahead and do that on both sides since I got black in my brush. And so I went in beside the upper jaw here and added those shapes to show more the depth of how the jaw locks back up into the skull. Now, an easy way to give depth to your jaw, because those back bones kind of point forward, is to make the inside edge just a little bit brighter so it'll come out at you.
I should have saved those 500 bones and used it.
Now, when I'm looking at my reference, I see that there are basically 3 shapes to the bottom of this jaw. I have 2 L's that lock into another square shape that has kind of a rounded top and bottom edge. And all I'm doing is painting those shapes. I'm not thinking that this is a jaw, because what you don't want to do is you don't want to get a image in your head of what a skull. You're not trying to paint a skull. You're just trying to paint shapes that will eventually look like a skull. All right, I'm going to take a little bit of darkness. All right, I'm going to take a little bit of shadow and I'm going to drop it in right next to that L shape on the jaw, just to lock in like where the chin would be on this guy. Now the bottom of the jaw got a little bit wonky while we were working on it, so I'm going to take my black and again I'm going to cut in my shape. So I just took my black along the bottom of the jaw and reshaped a little bit where my highlights went over or out of the lines. All right, so now we're ready for color. Pull those colors back out. So for shading a skull, I have sort of a reddish brown, a bone white, and then a little bit of purple and a little bit of blue for some shadow and some reflective light. Now if you look at my example piece that I did previous, one half of this is black and white. The other half is color. The way I add my color is with glazes. So I'm going to take my base brown, which is going to be the majority of the color on the skull. I want to add some water to my palette. Take some of this paint, and I want to mix myself up a nice thin glaze. Now you know you have a glaze when the paint is pulling in on each other, not super quick, not balling up like it's watery, but pulling in until it reforms in a little pool when you spread it out with your brush. Now I take this brush that I was mixing with, it's really loaded with paint, unload it, make sure that it's thin enough, test it on my hand, and then paint the whole skull with that glaze, even in the black. If you have any places where you pick up your brush and it deposits too much paint, Just move it around. It's not going to be dry. It's going to take a little bit. So I have one layer of color. Already, we're starting to see a little bit more life in this skull. It's not so black and white anymore. So now we've created a coloring book guideline. And all I have to do is paint in the lines. I can add more colors or more color, saturated color, to an area by going over it a few more times. If I want to leave my whites a little bit more white, I can just leave those, not paint over them. Or I can go back, I can add more white to it. But each layer of this glaze brings more and more color to my black and white drawing. I mix up some more wash or glaze. Or mix up some more glaze. Now my color's really starting to pop out. You can see this upper head area. It's my next layers. Getting a lot of that color. So at about this point, I feel like I like where my brown tone is. Let's take our purple and let's put some color in the shadows of our model. So again, just as we watered down and created a glaze with our brown, we're going to do the same thing with our purple. So I don't want straight purple. I want a dark purple. And I'm going to get a dark purple if I glaze over a dark area. So I'm going to go in the shadow here. And I'm going to pull in some of this purple. You can see here that purple glazed over, stayed dark, and has several tones in it, just like the brown does, because I glazed over my black and white area. So I'm going to hit all the shadows with a little bit of that purple. Put some color in my skull. All right, now my mid-tone. I want to take a little bit of blue, add it to my palette. Again, we're going to create another glaze because all we're doing is coloring the coloring book. I'm going to add a little bit of blue in the mid-tone right before my highlight. Just barely touching the model. So you can see right next to that purple where my shadows are, a little bit of blue. And that's to simulate a little bit of blue sky reflecting off the skull. As our light sources, when we're outside, they're usually blue. It could be in a sunset. You could choose to use some reds, but it's preference. You can add what colors you want. You can add 100 colors if you want at this point, because we're not worried about value anymore. All we're worried about is hue and saturation. All right, now I'm going to take my bone white. Now this is just to add a little bit of that more bone color, the lighter bone color, to accent our
across the board. That's
to accent our
different. So
reddish, more aged bone look. And what we're gonna do is we got this is still a thin paint. This isn't a glaze. And I'm gonna pull this into the highlights. I already know where all my highlights are because I've already painted them in. So I'm just pulling from the red into the highlight area. Getting less of that stark gray look and more of that naturalistic tone into the bone. Go ahead and hit my teeth a little bit. Now, finally toward the end, I'm going to take my white and I'm going to do just a few point highlights here and there on the model. So we're going to hit top of the temple brow, edge of the skull, here, these little 2 bumps right in the middle of the eye, like he's a mad skull. Add a little white highlight to the top of the nose, cheekbones. Just take it and just dot it a few times. Dot, dot. It's adding that brightness, that stark pop that reinforces all the shapes that we painted. All these shapes that just happen to look like a skull. And then I'm gonna hit the teeth with this white. Just at the bottom of the top tooth and the top of the bottom tooth. And there we go. So again, taking this black and white image, transferring it over to a color image after we've drawn all our shapes that look like a skull, combined, makes it a really simple method. Thank you guys for watching. Check out some of the videos on the channel. Check out some of the other videos on the channel, and we'll see you guys next time.